The documentary started out so hopeful of seeing exactly what you're talking about, where there's this nationwide movement of people in like traditionally non-religious areas, like big metropolitan cities in the United States, coming to Christ, like standing in lines in New York City to get into worship. Like it was a really, really cool thing to see. And then what happened is one of the lead pastors in New York City, as I mentioned, was caught cheating and had a drug addiction. And so the church kicked him and his wife out, and it felt like that kind of started unraveling the church because so much of the church was built around the leadership of this pastor. And it
Right.
brings up all these great questions. You know, we're a member of a very large church, and so we look to this figure, but we have to disassociate. You know, he isn't the church, she
Right.
isn't the church. But that's much easier said than done when you feel like your leader was leading you. You know, were they teaching you bad things because they had this dark side of them that was sinning? Are they just human and they can preach well but also sin on, you know, the side? But
Yeah.
that doesn't make sense because they're all one person. Like there's so much to unpack, and I see why it's such a shaking experience to have that happen in your church.
What I found interesting was that Hillsong was willing to keep a certain guy who had such a strong following and strong personality to maintain a following of people. But as soon as something big happened, that is like, there's no way that we can rationalize like what he did. There's no covering it up, like it's out in the open. Like he was just cut off. And
Hmm.
that is like kind of culty to me
Hmm.
to do something like that of just like complete cutoff. I've had my fair share of an experience with a church that did that. Like I decided my out of my own decision, like I don't think this is the right fit, and then I just didn't have friends from there anymore. And so that is not a good sign of a church. But the bright side is you learn your lesson really quickly and you know exactly like where to go, and that is to move forward.
Yeah, I feel like the thing to look for here, at least, you know, if I'm sitting here like armchair quarterbacking and saying what should have been done, which is very rich for me who never went to like theology school or anything, but it does seem like just cutting someone off and kicking them out of the church as a whole
Mhm.
isn't like the Jesus-like way to handle it. Like I
Mhm.
agree that if you're caught doing something like this, you shouldn't be preaching. Like I think that's fair, but I think the brotherly thing and the Christian thing to do would be to help them back if they're willing and if they're in a state of repentance, to help them back on that track, to get them the help they need. They can be in the church and be loved on by the church, but I certainly think that it's unreasonable to have someone, you know, doing something this wrong, this corrupt, this against their teachings, preaching on a Sunday. Like I see that side of it, but I think you're right that just cutting someone off could teach a lesson, but isn't necessarily like the loving way to handle something like this.
Yeah, and it's also like makes you question where was the relationship between the pastor who committed adultery and the other pastors of the church
Hmm.
or the other members of the church. Like, why is it that there was no way to work alongside him to help him get out of whatever situation he was in? Like, it's like there was no care for him.
Yeah, if it were me, I would feel like I was being used. Like, oh, you love me as your pastor when I bring people into your church, and then as soon as I don't bring people into your church, you kick me out, right? Like, you're right. There wasn't enough care and like not just what does this mean for our church, but like as a human being, this is one of like the rock stars of Christianity all of a sudden falling and being like, you know, hated on, and you know, the family being broken and the wife having pain and the husband having regret and remorse, and like there's not people coming to their aid and saying this is what the church is for. You shouldn't be preaching on Sundays for
Hmm.
now, but this is what the church is for, is to help in this brokenness. And
Right.
instead they kick them out. And I think that begs the question, like, what happens if someone accuses me of something, or if I'm in a bad spot and I can't, you know, quote unquote produce? Like it
Hmm.
just creates a competitive spirit.
Yeah, and that's something to ask yourself too when you're in a church is do I feel like if I did something wrong, like I would be supported in my efforts to remedy the situation,
Hmm.
or I was given guidance on how to get out of it. We could even talk about like addictions too and adultery. Like if God forbid that happened to someone in the church, can you see the church coming in to support that person in a godly way to bring them back on track, right? Because the Bible does talk about, if your brother goes astray, you bring him back on track. Like you have done something for heaven there. And yeah, like it's just sad. It's sad to see when people are left in the dust because that's not what a church should be.
Right. And another one of the big themes I think you're kind of getting there with this culture talk is the spirit of volunteerism and serving. Like most churches are built on volunteerism and people serving and being passionate about welcoming people at the beginning of the service, collecting the offering, serving on the worship team. Like most churches don't have very many people paid on staff. And so they
Hmm.
need these volunteers and these servants to be able to run the church. But a big part of the documentary was this really toxic seeming culture where people were expected to volunteer crazy hours. They were like driving really, really far. If they were sick, they just weren't like getting cut a break. They were being like removed from volunteer positions if they weren't able to serve a certain amount of time during certain periods. Like it was very easy to point and say that goes way too far, but it brought up this idea of like how do we run a church that needs volunteers and also put the health of each of our church members first.
Right. It's like people are being driven to the point of exhaustion, and it's like, well,
Mhm.
if you burn out, then bye.
Right.
But while you're still around, like we'll take every ounce of energy that we can get, every kilojoule from you. So that was really sad to see that it wasn't just the pastor, like it was a bunch of other people who had these aspirations to be in church, and they had unfortunately fallen away from church because of this like unhealthy system that was set up for them. It wasn't set up for them, it was set up for the growth of the church.
Right.
And that is not other centered. That's not Jesus.
Yeah, I feel like where ministry flourishes is where people's passion lies. And I feel like it's easy for me to say because I'm not running a church, but church has like very few essential functions that like it absolutely needs to run. And I feel like if members are passionate about an area, then you let them run with it. Like that fuels you. That's something that's filling. It feels like you're serving and being served all at the same time. Like that's wonderful. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's when you point at people and say, we need you to do this, and it needs to be 20 hours a week and you need to come after work and you need to stay late on Sunday. Like I think it's that, hey, in order to serve, this is what it looks like is a way different tone than we want you to find what you want to serve in. And that's
Mm-hmm.
hard because of course there are going to be times where there are jobs that just need to be done and it's not someone's area of passion. But I think the priority should be what are our members passionate about and what can we direct them to rather
Mm-hmm.
than what does the pastor think needs to be done and now we'll just make people do that.
Right. I don't know if you've noticed on our Every Effort feed, it's different than our personal feeds, right? Our personal
Mhm.
feeds on Instagram is stuff that we like as hobbies or to do for fun. But on our Every Effort feed, it's like verses everywhere and churches and videos and other Christian podcasts. And something I noticed that has actually come up as a topic is like ministry burnout.
Hmm.
So I thought that I was like, oh, I never thought about that because people, there's like this false notion that if you're in ministry or if you're working for a church, then it's going to be fulfilling all the time. And if it isn't, then there's something wrong with you
Hmm.
and not with the job in church. And I just want to say, like, if you're listening and you're part of ministry yourself, like, we don't believe that about you, and this shouldn't be believed about you by anyone else. Like, ministry is a job and it is a very special job, but we are all called to ministry as well, and we're not always going to be perfect in that. And it's a really hard calling to do church as a full-time job or even a part-time job, because I think there's that pressure, that mental pressure of like everything about me needs to be good.
Right. And then there's also that blurred line of boundaries. We were just talking to one of our friends who works for a church, and it's not normal to show up on Sunday looking for spiritual wisdom and fulfillment and relaxation in the same place with all the coworkers that you work with Monday through Friday. And then
Yeah.
you're also serving in ministry at that same place where sometimes you get paid, sometimes you're serving, sometimes you're hanging out with friends. Like there's just this mix where it feels like you always have to be quote unquote on. Like we were just talking
Yeah.
about this at church.
Right.
Sometimes it feels like you just need to be the social person or the servant person. And I think we should do a better job as members of a church of accepting that there's going to be really rough weeks where the person who normally serves has to take a break. Someone else may step up. Like, I think that through community, we can do all the things we need to do. But when we lean on individual people, that's when we run into trouble. And I think that's both a church level issue and an individual level issue where there aren't enough people serving, so the church leans on the few who do, who then get burnt out. And then there's just this kind of shuffling like system where we just need to get more people in the door to do the work.
Right. Something else talked about in the Hillsong documentary was the hierarchy of people in charge. So, yes,
Yeah.
there was the main pastor of Hillsong, New York, but there was another guy above him who I guess was also a pastor, right? But he was like the head guy. And so everyone seemed to have people below them, which, nothing wrong with that. That's organization. That's how a lot of corporate companies work. But the problem was it was like a little on the like dictatorship side where it's like this one guy pretty much made all the big decisions and was involved with different cover-ups but always had like the perfect answer to cover things up. Like it's almost suspicious. It's like that one politician who like gets out of every single crime they've ever done, but you're like, wait, but why have they been accused of so much? Like, how could this make sense?
Yeah, and I think at that level, you're responsible for the culture you create. And I think it starts with those little question marks or weird practices at the top, and then that trickles down to the way that volunteers are treated and the way that individual ministries are run. Like that culture is pervasive, and it usually starts at the top, like you mentioned, with someone who's higher up pulling the strings. And obviously, in this case, there was some really evil stuff with the founders of the church, which caused all these issues. And then
Right.
you could just kind of draw the line down and down and down where this person was, basically a predator at the top. And then there's someone below them who's steeped in addiction. And then below that, there's people who aren't treating volunteers with kindness and love. Like it wasn't a single issue you could point to. It was this whole culture. And like you mentioned, it almost becomes like a corporation at the
Right.
point where you're that large of a church.